All right, welcome everyone. We are just opening up the doors here and getting ready. I think folks who are joining us probably know that every week at 4 o'clock Eastern on Wednesdays, Elon Goldenberg and I have been holding live discussions here on Substack, live for those who follow J Street and me at Word on the Street and who follow Elon Goldenberg at Dialogue and Dissonance. Word on the Street is becoming J Street's home here on Substack. And we're going to be using this platform a lot in the months ahead as a home base for discussions and content and the writings and views of people who work for J Street. So please feel free to check back in here on Word on the Street regularly, as we are going to be posting a lot of video and more content in the weeks and months ahead. Recordings, I'll just remind folks of this conversation and all of our conversations are available on the Substack homepage, but also on J Street's YouTube page, on audio on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So you've got a lot of ways to listen and watch and a lot of ways to share our content with friends and family and others who may be interested. Please do make a note in your calendars about the 4 p.m. Wednesday time here on Substack Live. Some weeks we're going to have Elon and myself chatting live with you and engaging with all of you about the news of the week. We provide our insights and analysis on what's going on, whether it's in Gaza, on the West Bank, what's on the top of our mind, whether it is U.S. politics or U.S. policy or what's happening in Israel, in Iran, and all throughout the region. If you've joined us in recent weeks, then you know that we have been talking a lot, of course, about Gaza, about the war in Iran, and how to best combat antisemitism without allowing the fight against antisemitism to become a political wrecking ball, I'd say, without allowing it to become a weapon in ways that are against the best interests of the Jewish community and things that we really care about, like higher education. So some weeks we'll be doing this just as a chat with the two of us, and some weeks we'll be bringing on guests, as we did recently with Jonathan Deckelhen. We took a deep dive into the New York City mayoral race with Brad Lander recently. We talked about the race with several people in New York City who have different views, and all of these are available for you to watch. I'm just checking to see if Peter's available. He is available, so Elon is not here this week, and we're going to have a special guest, Peter Beinart, as many of you know. I think that we've got a pretty good turnout for this. A lot of the email and correspondence that I've had over the last few days has been people anticipating this conversation. We've already got a couple hundred people in the room. I am just going to have Peter join us. So give me a second while I handle the tech side of things here and send him the invite. Excellent. All right. Wish me luck, everyone. All right. So I know there's a lot of folks who are going to be joining us live and will be watching and listening after the fact because of the desire to see and hear from Peter. And here he is joining us. I think some of you may know J Street. Some of you may be joining us from Peter's list. Peter, welcome to Word on the Street Live.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Excellent. It's great to have you here. I really appreciate your making the time for this. I had actually thought you were going to be about 10 minutes or so late, and I have a whole sort of set of thoughts at the outset. I don't want to bore you with them, but I do want to just say a couple of words.
Sure.
To set up the conversation, if that works for you.
Sure, of course, no worries. Yeah.
Excellent. So everybody, please send your comments and greetings to Peter in the chat and say hello, and feel free to heart the conversation if you like what we're going to be doing here. I think that probably, Peter, I just say this directly to you rather than in the third person now and abstractly, but one of the reasons that I think this conversation has been so anticipated by a lot of people in the J Street community is because of how closely you were associated with J Street in our very early years, going back 10 or 15 years at this point. And I think I'm watching the names of people who are signing in to the conversation. A lot of these folks are folks who've attended J Street conferences or various events where you have spoken. I once referred to you as the spiritual leader, the troubadour of our movement. You really framed, I think, for a lot of us 10, 15 years ago, this crisis. You called it the crisis of Zionism, and you wrote the wonderful article in the New York Review of Books and a book itself. And really putting the challenge on liberal Jewish Americans raised on the values of the pursuit of justice, but also hoping to maintain a relationship to the state of Israel. You challenged us to think about how we can do that. Um, can a nation state of the Jewish people live up to its values? Can we have a relationship that is different from that was insisted on by the organs of our Jewish community, one that was of unquestioning support? And you really posed some very difficult challenges. Um, Over the years, J Street organizationally and I personally have been dedicated to answering the challenge you posed, right? To try to chart a path that balances a continued connection to the idea of a state for the Jewish people and the Jewish values that define our identity. You've come to a different conclusion that isn't reconcilable. And I think this weekend you probably read Ezra Klein's piece in the New York Times. He's a few years late coming to the challenge and posing it. You certainly posed it a long time ago. But for those who didn't read it, I think it was a well articulated piece about why American Jews no longer understand one another and the divides that have emerged in the community. Um, at the end, he asks, the core question, whether the ideals at the core of Jewish liberal identity, what happens when those ideals become incompatible with the reality of what the state of Israel is becoming? So Ezra posits that we've reached a fork in the road. You determined that you reached that fork long ago, and you made your choice that you don't believe in the concept of a state that has a ethnic and national identity like Israel as a state of the Jewish people. Um, I represent the camp that still, tries to say you don't have to make this either or choice. That we can unquestionably oppose this government of Israel, but not the idea of Israel. And I still believe that the way forward at this junction is to fight for an Israel that does represent the values on which I was raised and in which I believe. So we're going to have a good discussion. I think that's why a lot of people have turned out. It's a great turnout. And I really look forward to this. Peter, you don't really need any introduction to this crowd, right? You are so well known, really, to everyone. A professor, of course, at CUNY. You're a journalist writing not only in the New York Times, but you're editor in large of Jewish Currents. I see a lot of subscribers in the chat who I know are folks who really, love Jewish Currents. The Atlantic, CNN. You have a lot of great platforms. But I think more importantly for this conversation, you're the author of this recent book, which is Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning. And that's really what prompted me to invite you on today. And I'd love to now, I'll stop talking because this was how I was going to kill time if you were running late. So my apologies for making you sit through all that. But it's good, I guess, that you heard the way that I was framing the conversation for folks. Um, Peter, you started the book with a little section that's called A Note to a Former Friend. And you talked about the rupture that happened in that friendship. I don't know whether that was metaphoric or if that was an actual friend. I'm sure it's many friends, but I wanted you to start maybe on a personal basis, what all this has meant for you personally in your place in your community with your friends and family.
Thanks, Jeremy. It's really nice to be with you. I have so many friends. Even so many friends who were involved in J Street and have been over the years, and I have such kind of fond memories of all the different times that I've been in J Street events and the people I've met. I think before I answer that personal question, I just have to acknowledge that the kinds of challenges that I face living on the Upper West Side of New York, as a tenured professor, um, are in a completely different universe than the kinds of things that are faced by people in Gaza who are starving to death, um, uh, who have dozens and dozens of family members who've been killed. So, there's a part of me that feels embarrassed, to be honest, to be talking about these. Um, but I think that the reason I suspect that the reason I wrote about it is that I do think that, as you know, there are a lot of American Jews who face versions of this. That they're really, I think, one of the things that Ezra kind of wrote about in his piece, which I think is right, is that Jewish establishment wants to basically say that they speak for some kind of overwhelming consensus among American Jews. I always see these people saying the Jews feel this way, the Jews feel this way. I always think like, who made you Pope? Like, what election did I miss where you were? Actually, there's a very, very deep divide and a growing divide among on generational lines and along other axes. And I think because my social communal life is not actually spent kind of on the left because I, for whatever strange set of reasons, am in a kind of more Orthodox, observant Jewish community, and that a lot of my relationships come from in that space, which has given me enormous, enormous sustenance over the decades in my life. I do find myself quite often at odds with the people that I pray with, that I see on a social occasions, and it's hard. I know it's hard for them actually. I know it's hard for them often to be with me because I think some of them, maybe many of them, genuinely do believe sincerely that the things that I say and believe are a threat to Jews, and it's painful for me to know that they think that, you know. But it's painful for me to see people who I know in so many aspects of their lives are really decent and empathetic and good and intellectually open people, and that's why I am attracted to them as friends and who take Judaism seriously. That somehow I watch, and I watch as the months have passed, as the weeks passed since October 7th, day after day after day of seeing this horrifying slaughter and starvation. Most of the buildings, the hospitals, the universities, the bakeries, the agriculture destroyed, Gaza with more child amputees than any other place on earth. And I think, how are these people able to simply seem to turn away from this? And I'm sure you've had this experience. Like, you go into shuls, you go into other Jewish communal institutions, and there's almost no recognition of what's happening to Palestinians. There's a constant invocation of the hostages and of the Israeli Jews who were killed on October 7th, as there should be, right? That was very powerful and beautiful, and I'm grateful that I was in those spaces. But it made it even more glaring that as Palestinian deaths became 5 times as high as October 7th, 10 times as high, 20 times, and even when it's acknowledged, it's kind of like in passing, often with the implication that the Palestinians have brought it upon themselves. And I never, in a mainstream Jewish space, in an established space, ever heard the single name of a Palestinian. So, like,
Right, that's a key point you make.
times that we remember their names, but we never speak their names. And that's what led me to write this.
And you sort of said that the book is an attempt to appeal to that audience, right? Um, do you sense over the course of the time now that it's been out and you've been talking about it, is the appeal landing? Is there anything that you're saying that breaks through on any of these messages?
I would say honestly, among people my age, I think who kind of tend to be in the kind of institutions that I'm part of, probably not. What does give me a greater sense of hope is their children. I do think, and you know this, there's a huge generational divide. I mean, I won't name names, but I have given talks where people have come up to me and said something along the lines of, I really agree with what you said. It was very valuable to me. Thank you for what you're doing. And then I say, well, that's nice. And then they say, and you won't believe who my father is. You won't believe who my grandfather is. Like, I've had quite a few of those kind of experiences where people come from deep in the heart of the pro-Israel world, if their parents are rabbis or their parents are Jewish institutional leaders or whoever, and it's not transmitting in that family, right? And I often think, and so to me, that's a sign that the shift. Those are the people, in some ways, I think that we have more of a chance of reaching.
And you talk in the next part of the book, sort of the second chapter, I think it was, about the stories we tell ourselves. That and that we all were raised in, right? I mean, there's just a depth of communal experience and the framing of the issues that we were all raised in. Talk a little bit about how this framing over the generations seems to shape the stories we tell ourselves.
Well, I think there is a kind of public Jewish discourse in the United States that tends to see Jewish history and tends to see Jewish sacred texts as a story of kind of eternal victimization. You know, as a line from the Haggadah says, in every generation, a new enemy arises against us, and to almost see the Palestinians, or at least certain Palestinian groups like Hamas, as a kind of reincarnation of the monsters of the secular and sacred Jewish past. This is the first thing people said after October 7th, the largest killing of Jews since the Holocaust, right? As if this is somehow like the Holocaust, or that Hamas is Amalek, right? This figure emerges in the book of Exodus to destroy the Israelites. And so I think that I think many Jews, most Jews in the United States are raised to think of Jews in this particular role, right? That we are the kind of the righteous, virtuous victims, and then we are encouraged to assimilate Israel and Palestine into that template, into that framework. And I think in a strange way, it actually dehumanizes us, because to recognize that Jews are fully human is to recognize that nothing is ultimately alien to us, right? That we are capable of all the same different range of actions and possibilities and situations as any other groups of human beings. So the fact that Jews were oppressed for centuries in Christian Europe and suffered pogroms and suffered the Shoah, in which 2/3 of European Jewry were killed, the fact that our texts speak about genocidal anti-Semitism doesn't mean that in a different set and place in which Jews enjoy legal supremacy, right, in which all Jews in Israel have citizenship, but most Palestinians under Israeli control don't have citizenship, right? That Israel and Jews cannot be in a fundamentally different position. It doesn't mean that Jews don't suffer. Jews suffered terribly on October 7th, have continued to suffer, but that we are not, this is fundamentally unlike the situation that Jews face when they were facing anti-Semitism in Christian Europe. And frankly, it is more like a series of other analogies that are much more uncomfortable for us, in which in supremacist political systems, people who are suffering terrible oppression respond to that oppression with terrible massacres of civilians. This is not uncommon. Native Americans did this in the 19th century in the United States. The Mau Mau did this in Kenya. This happened in India. It happened in Algeria. And to understand the terrible and immoral violence of October 7th within that framework, rather than as if this is the reincarnation of the Nazis, and to center the question of the oppression that existed on October 6th in order to understand the war crimes that Hamas committed on October 7th. That, I think, is that we are not primed to think about those different kind of analogies, because it makes
And
us runs contrary to our understanding of ourselves as Jews.
and I imagine that must be one of the most difficult things for people to hear, because it has the ring of you are trying to find a justification, right? That there is a reason why this happened. There's a intellectually understanding the causes is one thing, but then in your emotional, state, providing a justification, I would imagine that's a very difficult line.
Well, I think emotionally it's a difficult. I don't think intellectually it's that difficult. I actually think we do these things all the time, right? We see terrible things that happen, and we try to understand the context in which they happen, right? And we don't attribute them to pure, unmitigated, trans-historical evil. I mean, this is one of the points that Martin Luther King made when America's cities went up in flame in the 1960s, right? And people asked him to condemn the violence, because there was a lot of violence, right? And he said, yes, I condemn it, right? And that's why in my book, I talk at great length, at considerable length, about the horrors that were committed on October 7th. God forbid, I would be in a situation where I were suggesting that this was in any way okay to target Israeli civilians. But I think what King was saying was that if we actually want to prevent this violence from continuing, right, and if we believe that all human lives, Israeli lives and Palestinian lives, are infinitely precious, we have to understand the structure in which this violence takes place, right? And there was a structure of violence on October 6th. All this. So Human Rights Watch called Gaza an open air prison. The UN has said it was unlivable before October 7th. My friend Mohammed Shahada, who grew up in Gaza, told me that every single person he grew up with contemplated suicide because there was no prospect of a better life. And that most of the people in Gaza their families are not from Gaza. They're from families of people who were expelled from Israel in 1948. And just because we may have forgotten that, they have not forgotten that, right? And so this context is necessary to keep Israeli Jews safe, because if you don't understand and have an analysis of the context, what you're going to do in response, in addition to being horrifying in terms of impact on Palestinians, it's not going to work. And look at what we've seen now. The hospitals, the bakeries, the agriculture, the universities are destroyed. Hamas is still there. I quoted the other day, I saw this quote from the head of Shin Bet, the outgoing head of Shin Bet. He said, "There is no way we're going to." I'm paraphrasing. There's no way that we can extinguish Hamas from Gaza. So if your analysis is wrong, then your actions are wrong, and you do terrible things, and you don't make yourself safer in the long run.
So it's interesting because I absolutely agree with you that if we're going to resolve this conflict, if we're going to get to a solution, we're going to have to understand what actually is causing the problem in the first place, right? You cannot solve the problem if you don't understand the problem itself from its roots. So going back, understanding the history is absolutely important. But the interesting thing I find is that the Israel right or wrong defenders, a couple of whom are in the chat with us today, good, yes, exactly. Their response is, but the history, if you run it through from 1937 to 1948 to 19 blah blah blah, it is just a constant history of Palestinian rejectionism and not wanting to do anything to allow the Jewish people to have a home. And so there is a version of history, right? There's a version of this. How do you respond when you hear that? I call that sort of the David Harris op-ed, which I got every 5 to 6 weeks in some other publication for a good 20, 30 years.
Well, first of all, I want to say to the people who profoundly disagree with me, probably disagree with you and disagree with me even more. I'm very grateful that they're on these calls. I mean, I always really appreciate it when people who have really different views come to listen, because people are so often only go to listen those they to
Yeah.
they. It says I like this line in Pirkei Avot in the Mishnah. It says, "Who is wise? The one who learns from all people." So I think that's really laudable. I I think this history in which is that basically can be summed up. Israel has continually offered Palestinians everything they could have legitimately wanted, but the Palestinians have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. I don't really know the actual scholars of Israel Palestine, right? Who teach, including Jewish scholars of Israel, including Israeli scholars of Israel Palestine, who have been in the archives, who study the history of this, who would subscribe to this. This is a storyline that exists in kind of establishment Jewish circles, but is very far from, I think, the academic consensus. And we could go through all of these episodes, but just briefly, let's say something about 1947, right? The offer that was made in 1947, Palestinians were 2/3 of the population. They were offered a state on 45% of the territory, right? And in fact, precisely because of that, because there were so many more Palestinians, but the Jewish state was getting so much of the land, that the Jewish state was going to have a Palestinian minority of somewhere between 40 and 50%, which David Ben-Gurion recognized meant it wasn't actually a Jewish state if it had almost 50% Palestinians, which is part of the reason Israel began expelling Palestinians before the Arab armies invaded in May 1948. Haifa and Jaffa, the two largest Palestinian population centers, were largely ethnically cleansed, in April before the Arab armies attacked, because Ben Gurion said explicitly, unless we have an 80% Jewish majority, it's not a Jewish state, right? So this is, I think, part of the story that this is left out of this story. When we're talking about the Barak and Olmert negotiations in 2000, 2001, 2007, 2008, which again, very well, I think the most honest reading of these is that Israeli leaders had a vision of a Palestinian state, but it was a very different vision than the Palestinians had, right? The Israeli leaders, first of all, wanted security control over the Jordan Valley, right? They thought it was too dangerous. They wanted Israeli troops in the Jordan Valley. They wanted Israel to control the airspace. They wanted Israel to control the telecommunications spectrum. They also wanted Israel to be able to annex a significant amount of land, because they feared that they couldn't withdraw from large settlements like Ariel without basically causing a civil war. I mean, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated before he withdrew a single settlement, right? So that Olmert, who deserves a lot of credit, insisted that Israel annex Ariel. And Mahmoud Abbas said, Ariel cuts deep into the West Bank. It cuts off the northern West Bank from the rest of the West Bank. You can annex 2% of the West Bank. You can't annex 6, or in Barak's case, 8, 10%. We can't allow you to have Israeli troops on the Jordan Valley because we're not a sovereign state. So these were different visions of what a Palestinian state would look like. It was not the case of Israel basically giving the Palestinians a fully sovereign state on virtually all the West Bank and the Palestinians saying no.
Just one little note about the Olmert negotiations, though. I will say that Bernie Abishai wrote a great retrospective on this, and he talked to both Olmert and Abbas. And I just want to make it clear for folks that they weren't that far apart. The differences that were there between Olmert and Abbas were bridgeable. What was missing was, in fact, the bridger. Right? Was a outside fair mediator who could have come in with the bridging proposals.
Yes, I agree. But he also says in that article, that 2011 New York Times article, that Ariel was a key sticking point. And part of the problem was that Israel had built up settlements, and so many people had moved to settlements like Ariel, that from a political perspective, it was extremely difficult for Israel to go, even not just to go back to the Green Line, but even to only annex 2%, because Israel had created a huge political problem for itself by allowing, and the Palestinians were like, I'm sorry, but just because you've created a political problem yourself by building these big settlements, we can't accept these settlements because they really impinge on our capacity to actually build a contiguous state.
So I'm curious, though, in retrospect, now that we're 14 to 15 years beyond that, I think it was a mistake on Abbas's part, not to take what he was offered. What we have now is the, experience of these last 14 years, not just this war, but a whole series of wars, never-ending violence, never-ending expansion of settlements. Perhaps in this case, taking 97% of a pie rather than the whole that you're entitled to might have been a better decision. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
I mean, I think that to be fair, it wasn't only the land. It's also the question of, is the Palestinian state going to be sovereign, right? We simply assume that the Palestinian state will not have a military, which Abbas actually agreed to, will not have control of its airspace, and will not have control of its telecommunications spectrum, and might even give Israel land corridors that can allow it to go through the Jordan River. No one would ever act that of Israel. Imagine the Palestinians say, listen, we have a bad history with you. We're scared of you. So your state has to be demilitarized, and we have to have airspace control over it. I mean, so there's a fundamental imbalance here. I guess I'm willing to say that Palestinians, that Abbas should have accepted Olmert's offer, in the same breath that I would say that Olmert should have accepted Abbas's offer, because I don't think there's anything more legitimate about Abbas's offer of a 6.3% land annexation than Abbas's position, which was, as I understand it, from a roughly 2% or 1.5% land annexation.
Right. No, and I think both sides could have gotten to yes. And the fact that Olmert was on his way out with it's now 2025, and what a leader can get away with in 2025 and remain in power, it's mind-boggling when you think that Olmert went to jail and left office for $5 in change and receipts in an envelope. I mean, it's kind of astounding.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, if that had not been the case, it was the end of Bill Clinton's, at the end of the Bush presidency. Obama had just come into office. There were just so many things that the timing just wasn't right. It's such a shame.
I don't know, I just came off my screen that someone is saying it was also about the right of return. That's exactly right. The right of return was also a very, very big issue. It is worth acknowledging again, though, that there is reporting that J.J. Goldberg did, for instance, and that the Palestinians made actually very, very large concessions on right of return.
Yeah.
We're talking about a number of 100,000, that Olmert was talking about a number of maybe 5 or 15,000. So, the right of return is an extraordinarily difficult issue. But it's not as if the Palestinians, again, according to some of the reporting we see, didn't make substantial concessions in their negotiations on right of return.
So now you and I just went down the rabbit hole.
I think Palestinians have a right to refugee return. So it's not like I actually think they have that right, but that Abbas was willing to actually kind of concede a lot of it. Go ahead.
So you and I just went down the rabbit hole that I specifically never want to go down, right? Which is to start arguing over what happened in 1947, 67, and 2007. And so I want to pull us back and back to the book and back to the fundamental points that you're making, and that I also want to get into a bit of a debate with you about Zionism before we sign off. But I think it is you titled this A Reckoning. And here we are, it's been 21 months, and I just don't know uh, how anybody can watch the news cycle day in and day out and not feel that what's going on has crossed their moral red line, right? I am not going to get into the debate over whether it is X or Y, what the label is going to be. I don't use the term genocide myself, and I don't think it's worth debating whether or not it is or it isn't. Whatever you call it, and whatever legalistic one wants to get about what it is, it's beyond any moral line that any human being should have to watch what is happening right now. You titled the third chapter of your book "Ways of Not Seeing." And I just do you think that this willful blindness, will it stop? Is it starting to stop? Do you see some cracks? Do you see some breakthrough in the American discourse?
I do to some degree. I mean, I think some of it is, yes. I think there are people, you mentioned the genocide question. We don't have to get into a debate about that. The Omar Bartov, right, who's now become associated with the claim that it is, initially said he did not think it was genocide. So there's been a shift there, and I think there are other people who may have thought that this assault was legitimate initially, and then basically have decided that now that's gone too far, and they feel like perhaps it's also hurting Israel's image, and they also have come to the recognition that Israel actually cannot achieve the goals that Netanyahu set out. I mean, I guess one of the areas I I, I think way in which I think I and J Street saw things differently is that to me it seemed very foreseeable that this war would be, I mean, not in all of its details, but that it would be a war of catastrophic destruction because Yoav Gallant said on October 9th that Israel was going to deny food and electricity into Gaza, and Netanyahu was talking about Amalek. And we know the character of this government, right? I mean, we could have known that I mean that Ben Gvir and Smotrich would, at least Ben Gvir and Smotrich would have a goal of the destruction of the Palestinian population. And there was reporting in the Washington Post that Netanyahu, right after October 7th, was trying to get the Egyptians to open the border so there would be a mass exodus. So to me, it seems that it was not surprising that the war would be fought this way and it would have these consequences. And I guess I'm curious. I mean, my understanding, and maybe I'm wrong, is that J Street only called for a ceasefire in January of 2024. And I wonder, in retrospect, how with the benefit of hindsight, which again is always 2020, how you think about that decision to initial stages of the war, not support a ceasefire.
I mean, look, it is very hard in retrospect, right, to look back and see what has happened and not say that one should have said on day one, don't do it. Tom Friedman said it on day one. He said, don't do it. That said, I can say in that moment, in the October 8th, 9th, 10th moment, that the overwhelming bulk of people in J Street really felt that the state and people of Israel had the right to respond. That what was done is something that was beyond any comprehension, and that, and frankly, I am sounding like I'm echoing an establishment talking point here, but no other state would have absorbed what happened on October 7th and not struck back militarily. And so the idea that somehow Israel shouldn't use military force to respond to Hamas and that it didn't have the right of self-defense in that situation, I think that was the right call. It also aligned with the majority of people in J Street. Obviously, good mutual friends of ours, within J Street did not agree with that, and people did leave J Street. We also saw a significant number of people come into J Street out of understanding and respect for our not necessarily falling into what might have been expected of us to do in that immediate moment. We said also very clearly that Israel's response had to adhere to international law. And it started to become very clear very quickly that it wasn't going to do that. We did call for pauses, humanitarian pauses. We were one of the first organizations in the world to use that term back in the early days of the fighting, to say this has to stop so we can get the humanitarian relief in place. There was a series of pauses. There were hostage releases all through November. And it was when it resumed fighting in December and into January that it was clear that Israel was not going to live within the constraints. And that was when we made that decision. Maybe we could have said something 2 to 3 weeks earlier. You know, I still think that up through that point, um, the right of the state of Israel to defend itself and to go after Hamas and the people who perpetrated that, what I consider to be, a crime against humanity, were right. But they didn't go about it in a way that accords with my morals, and they didn't do it in a way that accords with U.S. law or international law. And that's when it became time to end it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess where I see things a little bit differently, and again, I have the benefit of not having to run an organization where I have to think about all the different opinions of folks. I can just wake up one morning and think what I think. But was first of all that I think the challenge the challenge of using the analogy of what if another state were attacked was that Israel was not attacked by a sovereign state. It was attacked from within a territory that it already occupied under international law. Israel controlled the population registry. It controlled what came in and out of Gaza. So it's not like America, in my view, being attacked by Mexico. It's more like an attack that comes out of a Native American reservation in the 19th century, where you force people off their land into these smaller and smaller enclaves where they're they're suffering brutally, and then they lash out and do something terrible, right? That you have to understand that context when one starts talking about about rights under international law. And the
Right.
thing, I guess, where I would take a different view is, to me, it was clear from very, very early on, the first days of the war, that Israel would not be conforming to international law. The occupation was a violation of international law, and then when Israel cut off food and electricity, it had violated international law from within the first 2 days into the war. So to me, there was not. While it would be, I can understand the desirability of saying Israel should fight in accordance with international law. I felt like there was evidence from the very beginning that it wasn't.
Right. No, and look, I think that we can. One of the things I'm hoping out of this conversation is to model for people the importance of having these conversations across disagreement and, with friends and with people that you respect. And so I see it differently. I think whatever the entity is that attacks a sovereign state, the primary responsibility of a state is to protect its citizens, and that Israel had an obligation in this case, whether you consider Gaza to have been governed by international law of, state to state warfare or however, it's the obligation of that state and that government to take action when attacked by, 30,000 person militia and 250 people taken hostage, 1,200 people killed. So, we probably just see it differently. And I would say that um, in hindsight, that you are correct, that there are, that the signs were all there. Perhaps those of us who, hoped that perhaps the IDF professional class would go about this with a disregard for what the awful folks who are in charge politically were saying and were telling them to do. And that has not been the case. And it is distressing and horrific. And here we are, and now we're in month 22. And I think that the question now is what to do today, right? And what we are grappling with this at J Street. We are going to put something out. I wrote this week about silence is complicity, right? And at this moment, and who's being silent, right? What's being silent is the leadership of the American Jewish community. Where are our leaders? Where are our institutions? Some have spoken out. I don't want to paint a broad brush, but by and large, the institutions of the Jewish community have not. And so I think it's time for J Street and other organizations to turn our attention to our own leaders here and say the time has come for you all to speak out on all this. But what else can be done at this time? What's your view?
Well, I mean, I think that the United States has to stop supplying the weapons that allow Israel to do this. And the United States, I think, should say that we believe in international law. We believe that it should apply to Vladimir Putin. I think we believe it should apply. I believe it should apply.
Right, but my question is, what should American Jews do? Because that's not going to happen, right? You and I both know.
I would say American Jews should advocate for America to stop sending Israel the weapons that it's using to pulverize Gaza, and we should support the court cases at the International Criminal Court, which apply both to the leaders of Hamas and to Benjamin Netanyahu, and say that we should not interfere with those. And I think that I think this is the time of year, as you know, like Jeremy, that a lot of rabbis start thinking about what they're gonna the divrei Torah they're gonna give on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And I know many, many rabbis are very afraid of saying things that could cost them their jobs, right? Because you know that if you forcefully say not just that Israel is making a mistake, but that Israel is committing crimes, you're going to make some people in most synagogues very upset. And I would just say, and I just say this as the child of South Africans, you know, I wish these rabbis would be a little bit less concerned about what people are saying, going to say to them, the day after their Rosh Hashanah drash, and a little more concerned about what their grandchildren are going to say to them, in 30 years, or what confrontation they're going to have with God ultimately if they believe in that kind of reckoning. Because people, there's going to be an accounting for this. There's going to be a reckoning. People, in some way or another, even in the small voice of their own conscience, are going to have to answer for what happened. 4%, according to Michael Spagat, this who counts basically war dead for a living at the University of London, 4% of the population of Gaza has been killed. That's the largest percentage of any population killed in any in any conflict of the 21st century. Gaza has the most child amputees of any place on earth, even though there are only 2 million people. This is going to haunt our community, and it's going to haunt the people who speak for our community for the rest of our lives. So I would just say to people, they should act in the way that they will want to be able to they to so be able to answer this accounting, this reckoning, because it will come.
And Peter, this is why I so deeply appreciate you personally as a voice of moral clarity and a challenger to the best of us, right? And to stand up for what we believe. And so I deeply appreciate that. Just taking a second to welcome, we have a very nice audience with us live today here on Word on the Street Live. This is something we do at 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Wednesdays every week. So for those who are interested, I'm often on with Elon Goldenberg, our new Senior Vice President and Chief Policy Officer, and he and I chat, or we have guests on. This week I've got Peter Beinart, the wonderful New York Times columnist, professor at CUNY, editor at large at Jewish Currents. Not sure exactly
I,
the.
I also have my own Substack. Sorry, I should be self-promoting.
Yes, exactly.
Fine Art Notebook. If people are enjoying yours, they might enjoy mine as well.
Absolutely. I think this is a great platform for these kind of video conversations as well as for our longer form writing. And really encourage people to sign up for Peter's as well. So Peter, the nub of our disagreement, and I want to spend the last segment of our conversation here. It does come down to this question of Zionism. That is it really fundamentally irreconcilable to have a state that has a Jewish character, that is the national home of the Jewish people, that refers to itself as a Jewish state, and to have a democracy that actually believes in the rule of law and believes in democracy and gives everybody equal rights. It to me continues to be the quest of my life to try to find a way to get to that point where you can, in fact, square that circle. I don't understand why, in your view, it is impossible to get there. I understand the realities, and we can maybe talk a little bit about why it's so hard to see how to get there today. But then I have to ask you about the realities of a one state. So I'm curious. Let me just start there.
Sure. So, I mean, I guess for me, the theological principle that I believe in is that all human beings are created equal in the image of God. And so for me, the political corollary is that all people should be equal in the eyes of the law. Um, and to me, I don't think it's possible to reconcile the principle of equality under the law, that states should treat people equally, irrespective of their religion or ethnicity or race, with the idea that a state has a special legal obligation, gives special rights, gives legal supremacy to members of one ethno-religious group. And I think if we took it out of the Israel context, and if Donald Trump gave a speech or J.D. Vance gave a speech tomorrow and said, America is going to be a Christian and democratic state, but don't worry, Jews, Muslims, everybody else, these two principles can be perfectly reconciled. We would say, no, they can't be reconciled. If it's a Christian country, we are not equal. And I think that that's part of the reason I think it's dangerous to compromise that principle when it comes to Israel is because Israel is now a model for so many movements and leaders around the world who want to basically move away from the principle of equality under the law towards the idea of ethno-states, that states should be dominated by one tribe. Narendra Modi in India, Viktor Orban in Hungary, the AfD in Germany, the Trump's Republican Party. To me, if you believe in that principle, you can't you can't make an exception for that principle just for your group, especially because the exception of the principle falls very, very heavily on Palestinians, not just the Palestinians who don't have citizenship, who are most of the Palestinians under Israeli control, but even the Palestinians who do have citizenship. Their citizenship is a profoundly unequal kind of citizenship, one that we would never accept in the United States as American Jews, and
Sure.
inherent in the notion of a state that says we have a special commitment to Jews that we don't have to you.
So every state has some form of national identity, right? Whether it's Poland or Brazil or Hungary or whatever country you're going, it has a national identity, and then it has a population that is made up of a whole range of other people.
Yes.
And the concept that a state can have a national identity with a flag and an anthem and a history and a proud sense of tradition, and at the same time have the rule of law and equality and democracy and equal rights. Is the principle of Western liberal democracy, right? I mean, most Western liberal democracies have a national character and identity. For Israel, the identity of the state as the national home of the Jewish people does not necessarily, it doesn't have to mean domination. It has meant under this government and with the law, the nation state law, and the type of people that are leading the government right now, that is the way it is being implemented in these last years. But to oppose it, as so many Israelis do, and to fight against it in the streets for democracy, for the rule of law, for equality, to recognize the unequal status of the Arab citizens of Israel, that's part of making the state of Israel a better state. It isn't necessarily the case that a Jewish state has to be a Ben Gvir Smotrich ethnocracy.
I think that the way I see it differently, because for me, there's a fundamental distinction between talking about a state as having a national identity and talking about a state as having a religious or ethnic identity. Because the national identity should be open to people of all different religious and ethnic groups, right? So just you should be able to be a proud, an equal, being Brazilian and being Muslim should not be in contradiction, right? But being Jewish, since Israel's identity is ethnic and religious, it's Jewish, right? A Palestinian can never be Jewish, right? A Palestinian, that national identity can never really represent you in the way that being Brazilian or being Polish or being French, which are not ethnic and religious identities, can. And I think that was, for me, again, I say this with sadness, this isn't something that was just revealed under Netanyahu. The reason that Israel, I think, fundamental reason that Israel committed this act of mass expulsion in 1948, where it expelled 750,000 or so Palestinians, was precisely because to be a Jewish state, it had to have an overwhelming Jewish majority. And because it defined the state as having to be Jewish, it meant it couldn't have too many Palestinians around, which is why the Palestinians had to be expelled, so that the creation of a state with a ethnic religious identity required the expulsion of these people who weren't Jews, because otherwise it couldn't function as a Jewish state because it didn't have a national identity that could incorporate them as equals.
So one of the things I've always found that is at the nub of the most difficult part of this conversation is that there is no distinct word for the national identity of the Jewish people other than the word Jewish. It happens to also be the religion that, 75% of people who identify as Jews practice the Jewish religion. There's a good solid 25% that are, atheist, agnostic, non-practicing, secular, whatever the case may be. But, there's a time not too distant past when the overwhelming majority of Israelis were not religious, right? And were actually secular. When the state of Israel was founded, the concept in the United Nations resolution of there being a Jewish state, or all of the thought about it over the course of, going back to Balfour, or the rest of the time when people talked about the possibility of there being a state, it was for the Jewish people. It wasn't to give the state a religious identity. And as you know, in the Declaration of Independence, the ideal was put forward by the founders that the state should provide equality regardless of religion. And so the question I think that is so baffling about this is if there were a different word, and my father was a part of a movement that followed the writings of Jabotinsky on the right? And they always had these theoretical arguments about what if it were called a Hebrew nation? And you distinguish between the practice of the religion of Judaism and the identity of the Jewish people that followed them for 2,000 years when they lived as minorities, it wasn't because of necessarily the specific practice of religion that anybody followed. It was because they were identified as a different people. And they lived in other people's lands, and they came initially from this land, and now they're returning back to it as a people, not to make it the Islamic Republic of X or the Jewish Republic of Y.
But I don't think it really matters whether the state incorporates Jewish religious law. Even if it's a secular understanding of Jewishness, it still means that those people in the state who are not Jewish cannot be fully equal members of the nation in the way that would be possible in
So
Brazil,
why not?
because you can't be a Palestinian Jew, right?
No, but you can be a Palestinian Israeli with full and equal rights.
Well, but first of all, the name Israel itself is also the name of the Jewish people, right? It's the name that Israel.
Right, but the name France is the name of the French people. I mean, these are the names of countries. I'm saying there should be a state of Palestine, right? The state of Palestine should be named Palestine because it will be the national homeland of the Palestinian people. And
Right.
ultimately, in the context of what I hope will be a 23-state resolution to the conflict, there will be the ability of Palestinians all over the world to return home to the state of Palestine, become citizens in a state of Palestine that will not be open to the sons and daughters of West Bank settlers, right? And
I actually just, and I think it should. I would very much advocate that a state of Palestine should also be premised on the principle of equality under the law.
absolutely,
People of different ethnic and religious groups, and I the I guess I wonder whether does it does it trouble you at all that this language of ethno-nationalism that is very widespread, not just J Street, but very widespread in American Jewish circles, in which we talk about this state as the state of the Jewish people, right, of a particular ethno-religious group. That it does sound quite similar, does it not, to those people on the American right who want to make America into a white Christian ethno state, doesn't it? To me,
to me, no, because white Christians are not a people. That one is a description of their race, and the other is a description of their religion. Jews are a people, and they've been scattered to the winds across, the continents over 2,000 years. But whether they are dark skinned or light skinned, whether they're Sephardi or Ashkenazi, whether they eat leavened bread or not, they are going to be considered Jews as a people. And I see that as different. And I don't think you have to have an ethnocracy. I don't think you have to have a state run in the way that Bibi Netanyahu, Bezalel Smotrich, and Itamar Ben-Gvir run this state in order to have a state that is the national home of the Jewish people. I think that the goal of liberal Zionism is to have a state that is that national home that reflects the better part of our value system, that is a liberal democracy that values the rule of law and treats everybody equally. That's the goal.
When has that Zionism ever existed? I mean, if these are the good old days of the secular socialists who wrote the Declaration of Independence, you and I both know that Palestinian citizens of Israel were under military law from 1948 to 1966. They literally couldn't leave their villages overnight. They were under so there was no moment in which this state was ever offering Palestinian citizens anything according to anything like actual equal citizenship.
Right. It was 80 something years after the Declaration of Independence was signed that the Civil War was fought, right? And that we were still trying to figure out how to get beyond the original sin of this country. It is, I think, not fair to say to a country that has never done everything perfectly that it doesn't have the right to continue to try to become a more perfect state and to continue the process of improvement. I know, and I think that the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Israelis that are in the streets week after week after week, who are part of all the movements that and the NGOs and the wonderful people who are trying to push Israel in a direction that accords with our democratic values, with our understanding of what Jewish values are. They have their work cut out for them. I want to be an ally to them. I also want to be an ally to Palestinians who have the right to build their own state. And so since we only have like 5 minutes left, I want to then get to this concept of one state, because you've come out in favor of the idea that ultimately all 15 million people between the river and the sea should live in one equal state. And the biggest charge against, wide-eyed liberal Zionists like me is that we're untethered from reality, that there's no chance that there's ever going to be a second state in this land. But I turn back to you the question of, is there any reality to the idea that a Knesset of Israel is ever going to actually pass a law that says all 15 million people get the vote and we're all going to live happily ever after together?
Yeah, I guess I would just say on the Civil War analogy, I just think it's important to remember that the people who were on the side of abolishing slavery in the Civil War, right? The people we idealize, Frederick Douglass, William Lord Garrison, were not arguing to make they were arguing for the principle of equality under the law. They were not arguing for the principle of America as an ethno-state. I think that to ask the question of whether it's realistic to in Israel now to think about the idea of equality under the law, of course it's not realistic, right? It's like saying, was it realistic in the first part of the 20th century to imagine that Congress would allow Black Americans equal citizenship? No, radically unrealistic, because people in supremacist political systems overwhelmingly want to perpetuate that supremacy. It's only great moral movements that actually create different kinds of political possibilities. So while it was once inconceivable that we would have an army where you had Black soldiers, Black officers giving orders to white soldiers, the civil rights movement made that possible. I know personally in the 1980s, most white South Africans thought it was completely unrealistic. In fact, horrifying to think that Black South Africans would have the vote in one equal state that treated everyone equally under the law. So I think it's upon us to build the kind of movement, a movement of fierce but also loving moral pressure that makes what is impossible in one moment possible in another.
And Peter, you and I are unified in our desire for a fierce moral movement based in the concepts of equality and justice, believing in democracy, the rule of law. We're united in that. I think we just have a different view on what the exact, carrying out implementation of that is. I think that the hope that I have is that both the Palestinian people and the Jewish people between the river and the sea will be able to build states that are rooted in those values and are able to build states that give them a sense of home, a sense of national identity, and at the same time are built on the foundations that are what drives you and I morally.
And just quickly, I know we're running out of time. What would you say? I have friends who are Palestinian refugees, who were expelled in 1948, and who would say, how is it that Jeremy or Peter, after 2,000 years, can go and return to the places where they're, what's the moral logic that says that I don't have the right to return to the place that I was expelled from, or that my parents or grandparents, after all, for Jews have returned after 2,000 years? How do you answer that?
So it's good that it's 3 minutes left in the hour because we should do another session. I mean, because I do have an answer to that. Which is I think it is really important to recognize that both peoples have real legitimate claims, and in fact the recognition of the right of both the Jewish people and the Palestinian people to legitimately live in this land is exceedingly important. And if there's ever going to be one day peace, whether it's in one state, two states, 23 states, or whatever number, part of that is going to be this reconciliation process, right? And a recognition of the right and legitimacy of both peoples to be in that land. The ironic thing, of course, when you tour the West Bank and you go to settlements and they show you where, they found the coin from 3,000 years ago or whatever in Shiloh or Ophrah, the places where the Jews lived 3,000 years ago is going to be in the state of Palestine. And the place where the Palestinians lived in 1947 is going to be within the state of Israel. And so they're going to both sides have legitimate claims that are going to have to be recognized but not implemented, right? I think that's for those of us who believe still in the idea of separate states, it's the recognition of the right and the non-implementation and the compensation on the part of Palestinians receiving compensation for what was lost.
Great.
So with that, with that, Peter, I just want to say thank you. I mean, it was we have over 1,000 people watching live. I know this will get thousands of views, when it gets spread around because people are dying for a civil conversation, a thoughtful conversation. I just really enjoy always engaging with you, Peter. I want to thank you for coming onto Word on the Street Live. I want to invite folks to subscribe to Peter's Substack, to subscribe to Word on the Street. Join us Wednesdays at 4 p.m. Eastern live, or come to the homepage of Word on the Street on Substack for recordings of our prior conversations. So thank you. Any final words, Peter?
No, thank you, Jeremy. I really enjoyed it, and I particularly want to say that I'm grateful to those people who logged in who don't agree with me for doing so. I feel like that's something that I always find is really, really impressive when people go out of their way to listen to different points of view.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week, 4 p.m. Wednesday.